Good morning. Today's webinar is on the subject of RIOS 2016. We will give everyone one more minute to join us before we go ahead and get started. As I said, today's subject is RIOS 2016, an overview of the changes to this standard from the previous version of RIOS 2006, for anyone who is not already familiar with the changes incorporated into the revised standard for transitioning from the old version to the new version, but also for organizations who are pursuing certification to RIOS for the first time and want to become more familiar with the standard. My name is Austin Matthews. Welcome. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. I have an outline of the agenda on the screen. We'll talk very briefly about PJR and what we do. In general, we'll talk about the benefits and drivers for certification to a standard such as RIOS. We'll talk about transition timelines for organizations who will be transitioning from the previous version of the standard to RIOS 2016. Then we will look at a high level at the key changes of the standard, and then go into a little bit more detail with a clause-by-clause overview of the primary changes. We will conclude the presentation with an overview of the certification process for anyone who is not already certified and transitioning. We'll go through the registration process for new certifications, and we will close with questions. So feel free to type your questions into the chat question field in the webinar toolbar whenever you would like, and we will save those for the end of the presentation. PJR is one of the leading registrars in the world, and we've got a list here, not necessarily an all-inclusive list, but certainly gives you an idea of the variety of countries we offer certification. We are currently accredited to grant certification for a variety of standards as well, including RIOS, which is the subject of today's webinar. Benefits of certification for RIOS or a similar standard include improving the organization's quality, environmental, health, and safety performance. You might see this acronym several times throughout the presentation, QEHNS. Performance, as well as the minimization of risks. There are benefits related to material sourcing and outsourcing controls. It drives improvement or increased management commitment, as well as employee engagement. A certification like RIOS can provide a competitive advantage and or improve an organization's public image. There can be potential financial benefits besides the competitive advantage and improved public image that we just mentioned. It provides a framework for meeting customer and or regulatory requirements as you go through the process of implementing and maintaining the requirements of certification, and represents a commitment to the responsible management of recyclables. Those are just some of the benefits of certification. Obviously, there may be others for your organization. We are today, oh look, it's today. Today is the deadline to have transitioned. So this is a good day to have this presentation to make sure everyone is aware that today is the deadline. So today is the transition deadline based on the publication date of the RIOS standard in order to not have a lapse in certification and not have to start over with the registration process. So if you were previously certified to the RIOS 2006 and you did not already have your audit and close out your audit to transition, then you missed this deadline, and we'll talk about what that means in a little while. So before today, transition audits had to take place during a recertification audit. That was part of the RIOS transition plan that they came out with, that PJR had to follow, that the transition audit had to be a recertification audit. So your audit would have had to already have taken place, as well as have any nonconformities closed out and our certification body activities completed, which includes a review of the package and the certification issuance process. If you don't already have a copy of RIOS 2016, by the way, you can purchase a copy from Michelle, and here's a contact email address on the screen. So if you did not adhere to this deadline, you can discuss this with your scheduler as to what options you have. I believe you need to start over with a new registration process, as if you weren't transitioning from the old version to the new version if you missed this deadline. If you are in this scenario, you can either email me. My contact information will be at the end of the presentation, or you can get in touch with your scheduler. Hopefully nobody here is in that boat, but we can look into that if that is relevant to you. So just in general, the standard was revised for the same reasons that most standards get revised. So in general, to maintain market relevance, to ensure continued compatibility with other standards that are commonly integrated with it. So for those of you who are familiar, ISO 9001 and ISO 14001 were revised a few years ago. OSAS 18001 is being replaced by another standard. So as the other standards change, it has a ripple effect. So maintaining compatibility and the ease of integration. Also, ease of use is a reason to revise a standard based on feedback they might receive from a variety of sources. Make sure there is sufficient topic coverage for all the affected sectors or industries who utilize the standard, that it's flexible enough to apply to different organizations within the industries. They may be different sized, they may be different sizes or represent different cultures, a variety of factors. So the standard has to be flexible enough to be able to apply to the organizations who want to use it. And it also has to be easily understood. So if there is vague or ambiguous verbiage in the standard, that can make it challenging to implement consistently and audit consistently across the different organizations who maintain that certification. So those are common reasons why a standard may be revised. At a high level, before we jump into the specifics, the key changes in RIOS 2016 compared to the previous versions of the standard include an emphasis on leadership, a focus on proactivity and risk management, an emphasis on the outcomes of the management system, communication and awareness requirement changes, including those regarding stakeholders and customers, and requirements surrounding change management. So again, some of these or most of these key changes coincide with and relate to other standards that have been revised recently and reflect these same key changes, so that again, they're able to be integrated and align with the other standards. I'm not going to go through the key term changes. I want to make sure we have plenty of time to get through the slides and answer any questions, but the slides themselves, as well as a recording of the presentation, will be accessible through PJR's website after the presentation, within the next day or two. So if you'd like to take a closer look at the terms, they are in the standard itself as well as in the slide for the presentation. So I'm going to click through to the next subject, but these are in there. We've got some changes as far as replacing terminology, again, to align with the other standards and make them easier to integrate by using the same terms, things like that. So feel free to review those on your own time. Okay. So looking a little bit more closely at the standard itself, the clauses that are not included in this presentation would mean that there was not a significant change. So we're only going to focus on the clauses that changed in a way that's worth discussing today. So the introduction of the standard, just as an FYI, the introduction portion of the standard represents guidance information, but it is not auditable. So an auditor cannot cite the introduction portion of the standard for a finding during an audit. It's really just guidance. The first clause regarding scope and application of the standard needs to consider actions by outside providers. So when we're talking about the scope, you need to have at least considered this. And this will vary by organization how much this applies, depending on who your outside providers are, what they do, but the footprint considerations and the scope considerations need to include activities performed by outside providers to the extent that it is relevant to your organization. If you look at the definitions for the standard, an example of outside providers would be contractors. The RIOS outcomes section is entirely new to RIOS 2016, and it outlines criteria for implementing the standard, the intended outcomes of the standard, and a call for proactivity. And the call for proactivity, or the emphasis on proactivity, you will see throughout the standard, as well as several of the other standards that have been revised recently. This is really emphasized throughout the standard. One of the main takeaways, I would say, of today's webinar would be a greater emphasis on proactivity. So what that means is we're looking for more consideration and work on the organization's part on the front end to identify risk, to put operational controls in place to prevent those risks from manifesting in the form of an incident, which could include even a near miss, rather than having strong reactive processes to incidents at the expense of going through the effort of preventing those incidents from occurring in the first place. So if you can identify those risks, if you can put controls in place to prevent the incident from occurring, from that risk materializing, whatever the case may be, that is the emphasis here. Regarding the QEH&S infrastructure, there are requirements for assigning the various responsibilities required within the standard and a management representative. However, senior management needs to be committed, involved, and accountable. This is another one of the key changes and things that you will find emphasized in the revised standard. So it's senior management responsibility to ensure adequate resources are provided for the QEH&S, which is the Quality Environmental Health and Safety Management System, to achieve its intended outcomes. The point of the standard is to achieve its intended outcomes, and again, you can take a look at the definition section for more information, but the senior management is to be held accountable for whether those resources are adequate, whether they're adequately committed and involved, and holding themselves accountable for whether or not the management system achieves its intended outcomes or not. The documentation changes in the standard regarding documents and records are similar to that of ISO 9001, 2015, and ISO 14001 2015 for anyone who is familiar with those changes, where documents can take a variety of forms or utilize a variety of media. Depends on the organization's preference and trying to keep up with changes in technology. These requirements give a greater level of flexibility to organizations as to how they'll maintain those documents and records over the previous version of the standard. Clause 2 represents policy requirements and includes some additional requirements related to evaluating your impacts and risks, conducting annual reviews. Again, we see an emphasis on commitment for senior management and a couple other changes along those same lines. Clause 3 represents the planning requirements, and when we're talking about the RIOS footprint, the process that the organization needs to go through to identify its footprint, again, we highlight the emphasis on proactivity here. The more time you spend planning out and identifying the risks and hazards before implementing the relevant operational controls and conducting the training and all of the things that come after that, the idea is to prevent those incidents from occurring by proactive planning. The assessment for the footprint needs to include purchasing, source material acquisition, transport, delivery, things like that. It can also include positive impacts. It doesn't need to focus on negative impacts only. So some activities may actually have a positive impact on the environment or the health of employees or the safety culture. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And the footprint needs to be kept up to date. It needs to be reviewed for changes, assessed prior to making a change within the organization that could impact the management system. And there are so many examples of that. Changes like changing a process, introducing new products or services, changing equipment, changing the layout of the facility, changing chemicals or raw materials, changing contractors or outside providers. There's a whole host of changes that could meet this requirement. There's a new section for specifically related to quality risks, and this section requires the identification and control of risks affecting product and or service quality. And if you look at the definition section, you can find the definition of risk. Some examples might include employee theft, ineffective training, losing a key employee, equipment breakdown, things like that. Similarly, there is sections for important environmental impacts and important health and safety risks. These include additional requirements, criteria, and documentation requirements. So you need to be documenting your criteria for rating the environmental aspects. You need to document the controls for the health and safety risks that you've identified. This really formalizes the process and shows employees, contractors, auditors, whoever, what this process looks like. Legal requirements also include product requirements, if any, and again, as relevant to the organization. And again, the controls need to be documented. Product, service, and customer requirements is another new section within the standard, and it requires any applicable requirements be documented, as well as the organization's methodologies for monitoring whether or not those requirements are being met. That might include product requirements, customer requirements, outsourced activities, source material specifications, things like that. Those are just a couple examples. We're also going to be looking for verification of those requirements and records of conformity as evidence of, again, meeting those requirements and monitoring within the organization. Similar to 3.1.5, we have 3.1.6, which represents other stakeholder requirements. So anything not covered by 3.1.5 should be covered by 3.1.6. Who are the stakeholders and what are their relevant requirements? Implementing any controls necessitated by the requirements that have been identified. Reviewing all of this stuff annually to make sure it's not only current in that all the stakeholders have been identified and their requirements have been identified, like you haven't had any new stakeholders, but also whether or not their requirements have changed. So reviewing this annually for changes. And if you're not already familiar with the definition for stakeholder, make sure you check that out. It's easy. It would be easy to miss some applicable stakeholders, things like owners for the organization, the landlord if you have one, insurance companies. Stakeholders goes far beyond employees or visitors to the facility, some of the more common ones. So make sure you are, again, being proactive in the identification and planning process, that you've got everything applicable identified to avoid incidents down the line. There are some new inputs or items to be considered when establishing goals or objective planning. You're required to have written plans for the goals, identifying what tasks are necessary for achieving the goals, any resource needs, who's been assigned responsibilities for the variety of tasks identified, are there any due dates that would be applicable, how will the process or how will those actions towards the goal achievement be evaluated as to whether or not the goal has been met, things like that. So this stuff actually needs to be planned out and documented. And section 3.3 is a brand new section reflecting change management requirements. So this is a change consistent with the other recently revised standards again as well. So this requires a written plan for change management processes, essentially reviewing the footprint for relevant changes prior to implementing a change to the QEHSMS, which again is the Quality Environmental Health and Safety Management System. So again, we're talking about a proactive approach here. So instead of making a change to which contractors you use, which chemicals you use, the PPE you use, the processes you utilize, the equipment you install, the products you manufacture, whatever the case may be, prior to implementing the change, you are assessing the impact on the footprint and the management system itself, following this plan, this written plan for change management, to identify what, if any, risks there are related to those changes, to be able to implement the controls to avoid an incident when the change is implemented, instead of just going ahead and swapping out that piece of equipment or introducing a new chemical and then dealing with the consequences reactively. You would be proactively planning out that change and its impact on the management system so that you can hopefully avoid any negative impacts. Clause 4 focuses on implementation of the standard, no significant changes to recycler knowledge, but in terms of competence, you need to identify the competency requirements, maintain records as evidence of competency, and verify effectiveness of any actions taken to achieve the competency requirements. Training needs to consider additional criteria identified within the standard. And again, this is all relevant to the intended outcomes of the management system. So certain jobs, positions, personnel, they may vary in the potential impact on the intended outcomes. Some may have a very significant impact on the intended outcomes of the management system. Others may have little to no impact on the intended outcomes of the management system. So the competency requirements could potentially reflect that impact or the ability to impact those intended outcomes. The standard has additional awareness topics or requirements. So take a look at that section to see what has changed there. And similarly, there are some changes to the communication section. We have introduced a couple different written plan requirements, and here's another one. So the communication plans need to be documented according to 4.2 in the standard. Subsections to the communication requirements break down the different requirements. We've got a customer communication section, we've got a supplier communication section, outside supplier communication, which used to be contractors, external communication. So you can see for each of these clauses and bullet points, we're looking at different topics. So within that written communication plan, customer qualifications, if any, and any customer requirements would be relevant under customer communication and so on. So for supplier communication, we're looking at source control requirements, load rejections, errors, things like that. As I said, outside supplier communication replaces the old contractor communication section and has some slightly clarified language. So as that is relevant to your organization, you could take a closer look at that section. External communication could apply to a variety of different things like visitors and stakeholders, who needs to be communicated with regarding relevant QEHS information. This might be sharing emergency plans with visitors or local fire departments, reporting on-site chemicals to the relevant authorities, tier 2 chemical reporting based on what you have stored on site, things like this. This is really going to vary by industry and by organization, but you would be identifying what is relevant to you and making sure that your communication plans and processes encompass those requirements. 4.3 represents operational control requirements. RIOS requires source material requirements. So this section has been restructured from the previous version. This used to be found in the supplier section. It's got some clarified requirements here, as well as some expanded requirements for controls. So again, depending on whether or not you're sourcing materials, take a look at this section for the changes that would impact you. The outsourced providers, products and services section has also been restructured and pulled out of the contractors section from the old standard. And this houses some additional requirements related mostly to purchasing controls, documenting what specifications are relevant, any controls necessary relevant to the QEHS system and preventing impacts, records of any evaluation or monitoring you may do for this topic, things like that. 4.4 houses quality controls, and this is a new section requiring documentation of any specifications or requirements that are relevant to the QEHS worker instructions or work instructions, things like that. So what controls do you have in place specific to the quality requirements? And then subsequently, we also have similar sections for environmental controls and health and safety controls. These again are new sections and require documentation of those controls. So they just have it broken out: quality, environmental, and then health and safety, minimizing the environmental impacts and health and safety hazards respectively in each of these sections. And for health and safety, this can include hazards related to outsourcing, source materials, contractors, offsite activities, chemicals, equipment, things like that. So make sure you are, again, being proactive in your approach and trying to identify all the applicable impacts and hazards. And sometimes that includes going outside the walls of your building or organization to see where else your decisions can be having an impact. You choose, for the most part, you choose the contractors you utilize, you choose the raw chemical or raw material sources you utilize. So looking at the impact of those decisions, this is where the footprint comes into play as well. There aren't any significant changes to the emergency preparedness requirements, with the exception of any requirements you may have to communicate the emergency preparedness controls or plans found in 4.2. So the content of this section is no different. Just keep in mind or remember that in some cases or for some stakeholders, you're going to have communication requirements that you need to be aware of. So if you're making changes to the emergency preparedness plans, make sure you're connecting that to the communication requirements to update those who need to be kept in the loop about emergency preparedness for your organization. Clause 5 represents checking and corrective action requirements. There are some additional items to be included in monitoring and measurement plans found in RIOS 2016. There are some additional items requiring monitoring as well in 5.1.1. And then in 5.1.2, we're talking about compliance evaluations, which are now required annually per the specific verbiage in RIOS 2016. So on an annual basis, you're required to evaluate compliance to legal and stakeholder requirements. And we talked earlier about the identification of what those requirements are. This is focusing on the evaluation to see whether or not those requirements are being met. There is also additional verbiage for competency requirements for whoever is doing the evaluating. So whoever, whether it's one person or a team of individuals, whoever is completing that compliance evaluation on an annual basis, you need to be aware of the competency requirements within RIOS 2016 to make sure you have somebody qualified conducting that evaluation. There are some additional requirements in 5.1.3 related to maintaining and calibrating any monitoring equipment that you may have. This includes documenting the requirements and any actions taken to address out of tolerance monitoring devices. So not only are you documenting your maintenance and calibration requirements in general, if you find one of the monitoring equipment or monitoring devices is out of calibration or out of tolerance, what was done about that subsequently so that we can follow that audit trail, or you've got that record keeping to show what actions were taken and that issue was resolved. The outputs of monitoring and measurement are inputs to management review. It's an important reminder as well from 5.1.4. 5.2 represents nonconformance and corrective and preventive action requirements. And 5.2.2 is actually a new section covering or requiring investigation for all EHS incidents. So this goes back to, or it would be helpful to go back to the definition section and look up the definition for incident, because this includes near misses. So make sure that this process, your investigation process, is truly including all incidents as defined by the standard. For RIOS 2016, one of the changes to the standard and the requirements for certification bodies to follow includes that 2 audit cycles worth of findings need to be reviewed for effectiveness. Previously, the requirement was only to review 1 audit cycle. So what this means is when you are being audited by a certification body or a registrar like PJR, we would, in the past, have been looking at the NCRs or the findings from our audit conducted a year ago. However, this change represents we will be looking at the previous years as well as the year before that. This really is meant to have a better gauge of the effectiveness of the investigation process and the corrective action process for the organization. If we're only looking 1 year back, we may be missing trends in repeated findings or recurring issues. So if the corrective action process isn't effective, if the organization is not identifying, for example, the actual root cause of an incident or nonconformity, or their corrective actions are not as strong as they could be, maybe we can close it the following year, but we see the issue repeated. Maybe it's a systemic issue and the correct root cause wasn't identified. If we're only looking 1 year back, we might be missing, like I said, trends in recurring findings. By limiting the scope of that only to 1 year, we're probably missing some stuff and not getting a real sense of how effective that process is. So just as a heads up, we will now, going forward, be looking at not just the previous year's findings and the corrective action plans, whether they were implemented, whether they're still effective, whether anything similar has since occurred. We'll actually be going 2 years back to get a larger sample for the effectiveness of that process. I also want to note here at the bottom of the screen, and again, this is sort of moot in that we are now at the deadline for the transition, but just as an FYI as well, for the requirements to transition to RIOS 2016, that transition audit, it's required as well as any recertification audits going forward. So actually, it's not moot. For recertification audits for RIOS 2016 going forward, all NCRs, just at the recertification or transition audit, all NCRs, even minors, we need to have evidence of implementation prior to closure of the finding. So this is different in that for most audits, for a minor NCR, for a minor finding versus a major, we're looking only for an acceptable corrective action plan, which can be implemented up to between the finding being issued and the following audit, which is usually about a year later. So if you are going to conduct training or make changes to a process, typically for a minor, you would have up to a year to do so. And then at the following audit, we would be looking at whether or not you actually implemented the actions that you submitted to us as a registrar and that we accepted as your plan to close the finding. For these transition and recertification audits, even minors will require that you actually implement the correction and the corrective action within the time that you are given to close out the audit, which usually is somewhere between 60 and 90 days. So that's something important to keep in mind. Usually that is just the case for majors. And depending on the finding, that can be a tight timeline. If you are making a substantial change to the process or something that's going to take a while, you're going to need to get started on that right away, because before we can close that finding and close the audit, we're going to need to not only have an acceptable plan, but actually see evidence of implementation. So your correction and corrective action will actually be written in past tense. And with the submission of the plan to your auditor, you'll need to also show evidence of having done whatever your correction and corrective action outline as your tasks. So that's a pretty significant change. 5.3 covers internal audits. This is an annual audit requirement of the entire system. So you're conducting annual audits, however, prior to initial certification or recertification, which is every 3 years, you need to have the whole system audited. So this is clarifying or giving you the flexibility, I guess, not to necessarily audit the full system every year. So you need to have an internal audit every year, but the full system audit requirement is specified as, prior to recertification. So you could potentially be breaking up the internal audit over the course of those 3 years, not necessarily covering all of the processes every single year. That's something to consider depending on the size of your organization and the resources as far as internal auditors go. Finally, Clause 6 covers management review. Not significant in its changes in this section, but there is some additional clarity provided regarding the inputs and outputs required of the standard for management review. So for anyone who is not transitioning from RIOS 2006 to RIOS 2016, I'll quickly go through what that registration or certification process looks like. If you haven't already done so, you'll need to purchase a copy of the standards so that you can see the requirements of the standard for yourself, the specific language, what's required by the standard, what you need to do. You'll need to establish the quality, environmental, health, and safety management system documentation required to meet the RIOS requirements. You will need to train to the requirements, implement any operational controls or processes or documents required by the standard, as well as conduct your internal audit, your compliance evaluation, your management review based on the inputs from the internal audit. So you'll want to make sure the management review takes place after the internal audit. You'll also need to contract with a certification body such as PJR to conduct your audits. And you will complete a stage 1 audit and a stage 2 audit and address any nonconformities that may result from that audit. We'll talk about those audits in a moment. But any nonconformities that result from the audits need to be resolved before a certificate can be issued. So specifically, the stage 1 audit is a documentation review of the management system to evaluate your readiness for the stage 2 audit. So do you have that documentation framework in place that on paper at least meets the requirements of the standard? The stage 2 audit is an audit of the entire management system, all of the processes, all the shifts, really looking at the implementation of the documentation of that framework we were talking about at stage 1. So have you done what your documents say you would do, and is it effective in meeting the requirements of the standard? Again, any findings from the stage 2 audit need to be resolved prior to the issuance of a certificate from PJR or your certification body. If it's a minor NCR for RIOS 2016, even if it's a minor, we're looking for not only the corrective action plan, but also objective evidence of implementation, as we discussed earlier. After the stage 2 is fully closed out, you would be issued a certificate, which is good for 3 years. So in between the stage 2 and the recertification audit 3 years later, you will have surveillance audits. This can be semi-annual or annual based on your preference and your contract. and that represents a partial system audit, whereas a stage 2 and a recertification audit cover all of the processes. This would be a sampling and would only cover some of the processes, so it would be a little bit of a shorter audit. And then, as I said, on the 3rd year would be your recertification audit, similar to a stage 2 in that we cover all of the processes, and it would result in a new certificate, good for another 3 years. So the cycle starts over with 2 years of surveillance audits, followed by another recertification audit. Okay, I went through that very quickly. I wanted to make sure we have plenty of time for any questions that you may have. So if you haven't already done so, please type your questions in the question field. And this last slide that I'm going to put up has our contact information on it. So again, my name is Austin Matthews. I am the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. My email address is on the screen, and I can be reached through the main PJR number. Stacy DeSantis is the EHS Program Manager, and I have her contact information on the screen as well. And if you are a prospective new client looking for a quote for audits for RIOS 2016 and or any other standards you are interested in, I also have the phone number for the sales department who can help get that ball rolling. If you have any specific questions or technical questions that you'd rather discuss offline, Stacy or myself can be contacted, and we can do our best to help you with that. So I'm going to see what, if any, questions we have before we end today's webinar. Okay, we actually don't have any questions. I'll hang out for another minute to see if any questions are being submitted right now. Hang on one second, let me get this open. Okay. So we have a question about, I'm having a hard time opening this. If you already have the lead auditor training for ISO, will PJR offer training for RIOS? So that's a good question, and I'm going to have to look into that. Sometimes we're able to offer training to standards, and in some cases, the group who manages the standard oversees the training and conducts all of the training themselves, such as with the R2 standard, if anyone's familiar with that, or e-stewards. So I can certainly look into whether or not we are able to provide internal auditor training. Off the top of my head, I don't remember if this was discussed during the transition plan. So if you want to send me an email, I don't know why I'm having a hard time opening the questions. I think you included your email in there. Can you just shoot me an email? My email address is on this screen. The question section is not cooperating. So if you can shoot me an email, I'll have your email address to respond regarding internal auditor training to RIOS 2016. Thank you. That's a good question. Okay. Trying to see if we have any other questions, but again, this is not, I'm sorry guys, we're having some technical difficulties with the question section. So if you have any questions, since this is not working, please feel free to email me or give me a call, and we can talk offline. Thank you for attending today's webinar. And again, I apologize for the technical issues with the questions, but feel free to contact us with any questions that you may have. If you've already transitioned to RIOS 2016, I hope your audit went well. If you're a new organization pursuing certification in the near future, good luck with your audits, and let us know if we can be of any help. Thank you for attending, and have a great day.